Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Book 3 of the Royal Rangers series, The Duel at Araluen. Today I'm here with Chapter 23. Let's go ahead and get into it. The Scandians moved out from their camp just after dawn, maintaining a slow jog along the path that Maddie had blazed to the hill fort. Maddie led the way, with Hal close behind her. Stig, Thorn, and Ingvar were in the rank behind them, and the others followed in two files. There was no talking. These were experienced raiders, and discipline was tight and strictly enforced. All she could hear was the rhythmic shuffle of their sealskin boots on the leaf-mold floor of the forest. Down among the trees, the light hadn't penetrated fully, and they moved in semi-darkness. But from time to time, when the tree cover thinned, she could see the sky lightening in the east. They were making good time, and she estimated they would be in position well before the time of the planned breakout. Eventually, up ahead, she could see the open ground that led up to the ridge above the Red Fox's camp. She held up a hand, and the column came to a halt. Hal had warned the rest of the men that if anyone disobeyed her signals or orders, they would have to deal with him. As a result, they obeyed promptly. She mimed to Hal what they had decided earlier. She would head up the slope to reconnoiter, making sure there was no enemy patrols who might spot the Scandians moving into position. Hal nodded and gestured for her to be on her way. As she ghosted up the slope, the Scandians relaxed on the soft ground. Several of them uncorked water canteens and took long sips. There was no sleeping. Hal knew these men well, and he knew their tendency to snore like wounded walruses. He had gone to great lengths to impress on them that they were not to doze off while they waited for Maddie. At the other side of the fort, Horace was preparing for the cavalry to sortie. A 5-meter-long ramp had been built from the walkway timbers. It lay ready by the north wall, where a gap had been cut in the palisade. The cut section was held in place by ropes. When the time came, these would be cast off, and the section would fall outward, creating a gateway in the wall. Since the floor of the fort was 1.5 meters below the outside ground level, they had built an earthen step to provide footing for the horses as they left the fort. Once the ramp was in place, the troopers would lead their horses down it, then mount, and form up on the lower path. They would be seen by the enemy watchers below, of course, but, as Gillen had pointed out, it would be too late for them to take any significant action. By the time they could report what the troopers were doing, Horace and his men would be halfway down the hill and in full sight of the enemy camp anyway. A trooper came forward to report to him. "She's ready to lower, sir." "Wait for the order," Horace said. The man nodded. Already, the troopers were leading their mounts into position, ready to leave the fort. One of them was holding the bridle of Horace's battle horse, Stamper. Horace would be the first man out of the fort when the time came. He glanced at the sun. It was nearly time. He walked quickly now to the south wall and mounted the stairs to the ramparts. Gillen was leaning against the frame of the gate, studying the enemy camp below and the ridgeline farther out. "Any sign of Maddie yet?" Horace asked. The ranger shook his head. "We should see her signal any time now," he told the tall warrior. "Maddie knows how important it is to stay ahead of the schedule." Once they knew Maddie and her Scandians were in position on the southern ridge, they would begin the attack. She would signal to them with a flashing light. The sun reflected off a small polished metal mirror. Their reply would be a horn blast. When she heard that, she'd know they were lowering the ramp into place. A few minutes after that, the south gate would open, and Gillen would lead the archers out. "There," said Gillen, pointing suddenly to the ridge, where a light was flashing. "Signal from the hill, sir," called one of the sentries. Gillen waved a hand in acknowledgement. "I've seen it. Well done." He grinned at Horace. "Time we heard how musical you can be." "Ha!" snorted Horace. He took the horn from his belt, raised it to his lips, and blew a mighty blast on it. Gillen winced. Not at all, apparently. The light flashed one more time from the ridge. "She heard it," Horace said. Gillen frowned at him. They probably heard it at Castle Araluen. Horace ignored him and turned toward the stairs. "Let's get that ramp down," he said. The archers were already assembling by the south gate. 6 of them carried long ropes coiled over their shoulders, an idea Gillen had borrowed from the attackers several nights before. They would anchor them at the top of the hill, and men would use them to keep their footing on the slippery grass slope. He glanced around the ramparts now, catching the attention of the archers on duty there as sentries. "Time to go, men," he called. "Get down to the gate." There was a clatter of feet as the sentries hurried down the stairs from the walkway and formed up with the rest of their companions by the south gate. Gillen signaled to one of the men in the lead file, who stepped forward and raised the locking bar on the gate. The two halves moved apart a few inches. The archer looked at Gillen, a question on his face. But the ranger shook his head, looking around to see the progress Horace's group was making at the north wall. "Not yet," Gillen said. As he watched, the cavalrymen released the ropes that held the cut section of the wall in place and shoved at it with long poles. It moved a few inches, stopped, then moved again as the troopers pushed harder. It swayed for several seconds, then fell outward with a resounding crash. 6 men took hold of the ramp and ran it out through the gap in the wall, setting it down so the end overhung the edge of the path. They shoved it outward until gravity took hold and the end tipped, falling to rest on the next terrace down. Horace took hold of Stamper's bridle and led the horse as he scrambled up the earth step to ground level, then out through the newly made gap in the palisade wall. "Come on, boy," he said. Stamper's ears twitched nervously. He hesitated at the edge of the makeshift timber ramp, but Horace's firm hand on his bridle reassured him, and he stepped onto the ramp, clip-clopping carefully down, head held low to watch where he was going. Horace felt the ramp vibrate as the next trooper followed him with his horse, then the next. Stamper scrambled down the last meter or so, legs braced and moving clumsily until his hoofs felt firm earth beneath them. He whinnied triumphantly, then followed Horace as he led the horse away from the ramp to a clear spot where the others could form up behind him. Moving 2 at a time, the other troopers led their horses down the ramp. In 5 minutes, they were all assembled on the second tier of the path. At a signal from Horace, they swung up into their saddles, and he led the way down the spiraling track. Looking to the bottom of the hill, he saw 2 of the watchers, who had been stationed there, running to inform their commander at the main camp that the Araluen cavalry was coming out. He smiled grimly. They had a lot of ground to cover, and he could see that he and his men would be in position on the southern face of the hill before the watchers reached the Red Fox's camp. Seeing the last of the cavalry leading their horses out through the gap, Gillen turned back to the archer at the unbarred gate. "Open up," he ordered, and the man shoved against the 2 gates, pushing them wide open. Gillen led the rest of the force out through the gate. "Get those ropes fastened," he said. 6 men hammered pegs into the ground, then tied off the ends of the long coils of rope they were carrying. That done, they tossed the ropes downhill, watching them uncoil as they sailed through the air. "Take hold," Gillen ordered. The group of archers split into 6 files, moving to take a firm grip on the ropes, then beginning the descent. The long grass was slippery, and the footing was treacherous, but the ropes kept them steady and stopped them falling. They half ran, half slid down the terrace to the second level of the path, then continued over the edge of that section and on downward. Vicor Trask was resting in his pavilion. He had risen at dawn, as usual, to check on the hill fort and make sure the enemy were making no attempt to leave. Satisfied that the situation was unchanged, he had breakfasted, then returned to his pavilion to catch up on the sleep his early rising had cost him. Now, he was brought rudely back to wakefulness by the breathless arrival of one of his men, who shoved past the sentry outside the tent and hurled back the canvas door flap. The noise startled Trask, who sat up blearily on his camp bed. "What is it?" he said angrily. He disliked being disturbed, and his men had strict orders not to enter his tent without permission. But the man's words soon dispelled his momentary annoyance, replacing it with a jolt of alarm and fear. "General, they're coming out! It's an attack! The enemy are coming out of the fort!" Trask threw his legs over the side of the bed and rose rapidly, fastening his shirt and looking around for his sword belt. Finding it, he buckled it around his waist, belatedly hauled on his boots, hopping awkwardly around the sleeping chamber as he did so. He grabbed the messenger by the arm to regain his balance. "How many? Where are they?" The man grabbed his arm in return and began dragging him toward the doorway. "Looks like all of them. The archers, anyway. They're coming out the main gate." They blundered out into the open, Trask shielding his eyes from the mid-morning glare of the sun. He hurried to a vantage point closer to his tent that commanded a view of the hill fort above them. He peered up the hill, and his heart began to race as he saw the group of armed men emerging from the gate, throwing ropes down the hill and beginning to descend to the next level of the track. He estimated there were about a score of them, which he knew to be the full complement of archers under Horace's command. But where were the cavalry? He looked urgently left and right and saw no sign of them. Then a file of horsemen appeared, riding around the contour of the slope, already at the third level down from the fort. 20 of them, too, he estimated. He turned to the messenger who had woken him. "Sound the alarm," he shouted, and the man raced away to find a bugler. A few seconds later, the strident notes of the alarm call blared out, and men began to spill from their tents, pulling on their armor and helmets, buckling swords around their waists. One of his subordinate commanders ran up to him. "What are your orders, General?" Trask hesitated, then indicated a line across the front of their camp at the base of the slope. "Form a shield wall there," he said. 2 ranks. We'll let them come to us." The commander saluted and ran off, shouting orders. Gradually, the milling mass of men began to form themselves into some sort of order, pushed and shoved into position by their sergeants and corporals. They moved into 2 ranks, shields locked together, spears set at an angle, facing the enemy uphill, with 40 men in each rank. The remaining 20 or so men grouped themselves around Trask as a mobile reserve. If part of the shield wall was threatened, they would provide support and reinforcements. Still, the archers swarmed down the terraces of the hill. On the right wing, the cavalrymen urged their horses, stiff-legged against the slope, down to the final level, which was one terrace up from the base of the hill where the rapidly formed shield wall stood waiting. 10 troopers halted there, threatening the right wing. The others continued to move around the south face of the hill until they had joined the archers. They wheeled their horses around to face downhill. Only one gently sloping section of grass now separated them from the Red Fox force. Trask glanced nervously from one group to the other. The 10 mounted men, lances held vertically, remained threatening the right wing of his force. The combined group of archers and troopers faced the center of his shield wall. He heard one of his officers calling orders on the right and saw the right-hand end of the shield wall pivot back through 90 degrees, like a gate moving on a hinge, so that they stood square on to the troopers, facing them directly with shields and spears. He heard a whisper of noise from the archers facing his center. Then the scraping sound of arrows being released from their bows, and the first arrow storm was on its way. "Shields up!" shouted the officer commanding the center of the wall. The shields rattled and clashed together as the men raised them to deflect the arrows. Trask suddenly realized he was unarmored. He grabbed the nearest soldier by the arm and shoved him in the direction of his tent, stripping the man's shield from him as he did so. "Get my armor," he ordered, and the man ran off to do his bidding. Trask slipped the shield over his left arm and raised it to cover his head and upper body. He was not a moment too soon. A second later, he staggered as an arrow slammed into the shield. It struck slightly off-center and nearly tore the shield from his arm. He regained his balance and lowered the shield to look uphill. The archers were releasing another volley. Hastily, he raised the shield again, hearing cries of pain from his men in the shield wall as arrows found their way through the gaps and struck home. His mouth dried as he realized this would be the final confrontation. The enemy had committed all their men to this fight. Then he calmed himself. He had them outnumbered by 3-1. He'd lose some men, he knew. The enemy were skilled fighters, but sheer force of numbers would see him through. And with their entire force committed, the Araluens could do nothing to surprise him. He smiled. Now, all he had to do was make sure he stayed well clear of the fighting. And that is going to be the end of chapter number 23. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you next time in chapter 24. God bless, and have a good one.